James was not a man who had been handed much in life. He grew up in a small town where money was always short, and every dream seemed too expensive to touch. From a young age, he learned what hard work meant. He worked at the local gas station. As a teenager, then became a mechanic, fixing cars late into the night. People often looked at his tired hands and wondered how he managed to keep going, but James had something inside him that kept him moving. Hope. He believed that if he worked hard enough, one day he would own something that no one could take away. That dream was land. James wanted a place where the world couldn't tell him how to live, a place where he could breathe without judgment, where his family and friends could come and feel safe. More than anything, he wanted peace. He had seen too many years of struggle, of people looking down on him, of life pressing him into corners. He wanted wide open fields, where the sky felt endless. It took him nearly 20 years of saving. Every broken down truck he fixed, every extra shift he took, every dollar he put away, all went into a jar marked the ranch. Some people laughed at him. Others told him he should spend his money on easier dreams, like a new car or a small house in town. But James didn't want easy. He wanted his land, and finally, that day came. He found it on the edge of a quiet town, a stretch of fields, a small creek, and an old farmhouse with peeling paint. To some people, it looked like nothing special. But when James first stepped onto that soil, his chest tightened. It wasn't just dirt, it was freedom. He could almost see the life he had imagined. Horses grazing in the field, vegetables growing in neat rows, mornings filled with sunlight instead of city noise. The farmhouse needed work. The barn leaned a little to the left. The fences were old and weak. But James didn't see problems, he saw promises. He saw a place where he could build something real with his own 2 hands. So he signed the papers, handed over the money, and for the first time in his life, he owned land that was truly his. The first morning he woke up in that farmhouse, he sat on the porch with a cup of coffee. The sun rose slowly, spilling orange light over the fields, and for a moment, James forgot every hardship he had ever faced. The air was cool and quiet, broken only by the sound of birds. He closed his eyes and thought, "This is mine. No one can take this from me." He started small. He planted a vegetable garden. He mended the fences. He rescued 2 horses from a shelter and gave them a home. On weekends, he invited his nieces and nephews over to run in the fields, laughing until their voices echoed across the land. He fixed broken tractors for neighbors, asking for nothing but a handshake in return. The ranch was more than just a property to him, it was a piece of his heart, a safe place where he could finally rest from the battles of life. But not everyone saw it that way. Some of the neighbors whispered about his old pickup trucks parked out front, the ones he used for work. They frowned at the chicken coop he built by hand. They didn't like the sound of horses running across the field, and though they never said it out loud, James could feel it, the cold stares, the disapproving eyes, the unspoken thought that maybe, just maybe, they didn't think a man like him belonged there. Still, James ignored it. He told himself that land was land, and no one could tell him he didn't belong on his own. Every morning he walked the fields with his head held high, boots sinking into the earth he had bought with his sweat and sacrifice. He had fought too hard to let anyone steal his joy. What James didn't know was that his battle for peace was only beginning. The land he loved so dearly was about to become a prison, built not by nature or chance, but by the very people who could not stand to see him free. At first, life on the ranch was peaceful. James spent his days fixing things, tending to his horses, and planting more vegetables in his garden. The land gave him purpose, and every evening he felt proud when he looked at what his hands had built. But soon, small signs began to appear that not everyone around him wanted him there. The ranch shared a border with a wealthy neighborhood run by a strict homeowners association, or HOA. The neighborhood was full of polished houses with bright green lawns, driveways, lined with new cars, and mailboxes that all looked the same. Everything about it was neat, controlled, and perfectly trimmed. The people there liked order. They liked things done their way. And to them, James's ranch was an eyesore. At first, the complaints were small. One neighbor told him that his old pickup trucks looked out of place when parked in his driveway. Another frowned at the sound of his horses running across the field in the morning. Someone else muttered about the chickens he kept, saying they didn't belong so close to a proper neighborhood. James always listened politely, but inside, he felt the sting. He had worked all his life for this land, yet it seemed some people believed he didn't deserve it simply because it didn't match their perfect little picture. One day, James returned home from town to find a letter taped to his gate. It was from the HOA. The letter demanded that he maintain the standards of the community and remove unsightly vehicles and animals. James read the words twice, shaking his head in disbelief. His ranch wasn't even part of their HOA. He didn't pay their fees. He didn't agree to their rules. His land was separate. Still, the letters kept coming. Each one was colder, harsher, more threatening. They spoke of property values and community expectations. But James understood the real message hidden inside. You don't belong here. The more they pushed, the more James resisted. He fixed cars in his driveway proudly. He let his horses run free across the field. He waved at the neighbors even when they refused to wave back. He thought if he just kept living his life, they would eventually leave him alone. But the HOA had other plans. One afternoon, James drove back from the mechanic shop where he worked. As he turned the corner to his road, his truck slowed. His stomach dropped. A massive metal fence had been built along the edge of his ranch. It stretched high and wide, blocking the open view he loved so much. It wasn't just on one side either. The fence ran around 3 sides of his property, like a steel wall. And at the one narrow road that led in and out of his land, there stood a tall gate with a heavy chain and lock. James parked his truck and walked up to the gate in disbelief. The lock clicked shut, cold and final. His land, the land he had worked for, bled for, dreamed about, was surrounded, caged. The next day James went straight to the HOA president, a man named Richard. Richard was tall, sharp-dressed, with a smile that never reached his eyes. James asked calmly, "Why did you put a fence around my ranch?" Richard leaned back in his chair and said smoothly, "The fence is for security. We can't have outsiders coming in and out freely. The gate protects the community." James clenched his fists. "But this is my property. I'm not part of your HOA. You can't just lock me out." Richard's smile widened, cold and mocking. "If you want access, you'll need a key. But keys are only given to HOA members. Perhaps you should consider joining us." The meaning was clear. They hadn't built the fence for security. They had built it for control. From that day on, James's life changed. Every time he left his ranch, he had to wait by that gate until someone else decided to let him in. Sometimes neighbors ignored him, driving past as if he didn't exist. Sometimes he sat there for an hour, trapped, humiliated, powerless. The land that had once felt like freedom now felt like a prison, and the people who had put up that fence smiled as though they had won. But deep down, James knew one thing. This fight wasn't over. At first, James tried to believe that things would get better. Maybe the neighbors would realize the fence was unfair. Maybe the HOA would come to their senses. He told himself to be patient, to stay calm, to avoid conflict. But with every passing day, the truth became harder to ignore. The fence was not going anywhere. The lock was not coming off. Life on the ranch began to feel smaller, heavier, and lonelier. What had once been wide-open freedom now felt like a cage. Every time James left his land, he had to stop at the gate. If he was lucky, a neighbor would pull over and unlock it after a few minutes. If he was unlucky, they would drive right past, pretending not to see him sitting there. More than once, James sat in his old pickup truck for nearly an hour, watching car after car speed through the gate, while he remained stuck outside, powerless to enter his own home. The humiliation was unbearable. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, James returned home from the grocery store. His truck was loaded with supplies, bags of grain for the horses, chicken feed, vegetables for himself. But when he reached the gate, no one was around. He waited. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. The sky darkened, and still no one came. By the time a neighbor finally arrived and grudgingly opened the lock, James's groceries had spoiled in the heat. He carried them inside with a heavy heart, wondering how much more he could take. It wasn't just about waiting at the gate. The fence slowly began to cut him off from the world. Delivery trucks refused to come anymore because they couldn't get through without a key. Friends stopped visiting because it was too much trouble to wait for someone to let them in. Even his family, who once loved spending weekends running through his fields, came less and less. The children hated sitting in the car outside the gate, bored and restless, while grown-ups argued about who would open it. The loneliness began to creep into James's bones. He would sit on his porch in the evenings, staring at the fence that surrounded him. He thought of all the years he had worked, all the money he had saved, all the nights he had prayed for this land. Now, here he was locked in like a prisoner, treated like an intruder on his own property. The final blow came on a night when one of his horses fell sick. James noticed the mare pacing in her stall, her sides heaving, her eyes wide with pain. He knew she needed a vet immediately. He loaded her into the trailer, his heart pounding with worry, and sped toward the gate. But when he arrived, the gate was locked. No one was around. He called the HOA number posted nearby, but no one answered. He honked his horn again and again, praying someone would hear. Minutes passed like hours. His horse cried weakly in the trailer, and James could do nothing but wait. By the time a neighbor finally arrived and slowly unlocked the gate, it was too late. The mare collapsed before they even reached the vet. James stood there in the cold night, holding her lifeless head in his hands, tears streaming down his face. He had saved her once from a shelter, giving her freedom and love, and now she had died because of a locked gate. That night, James sat in his barn long after midnight. The air was heavy with silence, broken only by his quiet sobs. He realized that the fence was not just an inconvenience, it was a weapon. The HOA had built it to break him, to remind him every day that he was powerless, that they could control his life. For the first time since buying the ranch, James felt something he had never felt there before: despair. The land that had once been his dream now felt like a nightmare. His heart ached, but somewhere deep inside, beneath the grief, another feeling began to stir: anger. The days after the death of his horse were some of the darkest James had ever known. The barn, once full of life and movement, felt empty. Each time he walked past the stall where his mare had once stood, his chest tightened with grief. He replayed that night in his mind again and again: the long wait at the gate, the helpless cries of his horse, the cold silence when her body finally went still. The fence hadn't just taken his freedom, it had stolen a life that mattered to him. James tried to carry on as best as he could, but the weight of it never left him. He continued to wake up early, feeding his animals, tending to his garden, fixing broken fences. On the outside, he kept moving, but inside, he was breaking. Each trip to the gate filled him with dread. Each letter from the HOA filled him with anger. His neighbors, meanwhile, seemed pleased. Richard, the HOA president, passed him one morning while James was loading hay. Richard's polished SUV slowed just long enough for him to roll down the window. "You know," he said with a smirk, "all of this would be easier if you joined the HOA. Rules are rules, after all." Then he drove away, leaving James standing in the dust with his fists clenched. That was the moment James realized the fence had never been about security. It had been about control. It had been about power, and it had been about reminding him that he was an outsider. No matter how much he had worked for his land, the isolation grew worse. Friends stopped calling, family stopped visiting. The children, who used to laugh and run through his fields, no longer came. Deliveries, appointments, even simple trips to the grocery store became battles with the locked gate. Some days James didn't leave at all. It was easier to stay inside his cage than to fight for the chance to come and go. But the breaking point came one late evening when James returned from work. He had stayed late at the mechanic shop, fixing a tractor for a farmer who needed it. The next day, by the time he reached his road, the sky was already dark. At the gate, he stopped and waited. Minutes passed. His headlights glared against the tall metal bars. He honked once, then twice. Nobody came. He called the number posted on the fence. No answer. He leaned his head against the steering wheel, exhausted. He had been working since dawn, and all he wanted was to go home, to sit on his porch, to rest. But the gate would not open. After nearly an hour, a neighbor finally arrived. The man stepped out of his car slowly, keys in hand, his eyes cold. He unlocked the gate with deliberate slowness, then muttered, "Maybe you should just move. This isn't the place for you." The words hit James harder than he expected. They cut deep, sharper than the fence itself. He drove through the gate, silently, his jaw tight, his hands trembling on the wheel. When he reached his farmhouse, he sat in the truck for a long time, staring into the darkness. Something inside him broke that night. He realized the fence wasn't just metal. It wasn't just wood and wire. It was a message that he didn't belong. That no matter how hard he worked, some people would never let him be free. For the first time since owning the ranch, James thought about selling it. The thought felt like defeat, but the pain of living caged in was crushing him. Could he really keep going like this? Could he spend the rest of his life waiting at a gate, begging for permission to enter his own land? He sat in his barn, staring at the ground, tears burning his eyes. His calloused hands trembled, not from weakness, but from the weight of years of struggle. He had fought so hard for this land. He had poured his soul into it, and now he felt it slipping through his fingers. But as he sat there in the silence, another thought crept into his mind. Maybe there was another way. Maybe he didn't have to surrender. Maybe, just maybe, he could fight back not with fists or anger, but with something stronger. For the first time in weeks, James lifted his head. His eyes, though red from grief, carried a new spark. He didn't know how yet, but he knew one thing for certain. He would not let them break him. The fence had taken his peace, his horse, and nearly his spirit, but it would not take his soul. The morning after that long night in the barn, James woke up with a heaviness in his chest, but also with a quiet determination. The idea that had entered his mind the night before would not leave him. He had spent years letting life push him around, working harder than most just to survive, but this time he couldn't bend. If he gave up his land now, he would be surrendering more than soil and wood. He would be surrendering his dignity. For days, he thought about the fence, about Richard's smug smile, about every minute he had sat trapped at the gate. He knew anger alone wouldn't solve anything. He needed knowledge. He needed to understand how the HOA had been able to do what they did. So he went to the county office, a small brick building with faded letters on the front. Inside, the clerk looked surprised when James asked for property records. Few people bothered with those dusty shelves of files, but James insisted. He sat for hours in the quiet room, flipping through old maps, deeds, and land surveys. The smell of paper and ink filled the air as his tired eyes scanned line after line of text. He wasn't even sure what he was looking for, only that somewhere, hidden in those papers, might be the answer he needed. At first, everything looked ordinary. His land was marked clearly, the boundaries drawn just as he remembered. The fence, though cruel, was technically on the edge of the neighborhood's property. But then his eyes landed on something that made him stop. The strip of land where the gate now stood, the only road in and out of his ranch, was not listed under the HOA. It was a narrow stretch, barely wide enough for 2 cars to pass, but it was crucial. Without it, no one could reach the ranch. The name on the file was unfamiliar, a woman who lived out of state, someone who had inherited the land years ago. James's heart began to race. The HOA had built their gate on land that wasn't theirs. The gate was not their property at all. For the first time in months, James felt a spark of hope. He wrote down the contact information and spent the next week trying to reach the owner. At first, there was no reply. Days dragged by, and James feared his chance might slip away. But finally, one evening, his phone rang. The woman's voice was gentle, a little tired. She explained that the land had been in her family for years, but she had no use for it. She didn't even live in the state anymore. James took a deep breath and asked the question that could change everything. Would you be willing to sell it? There was a pause on the line. For a moment, James feared she would say no. But then, almost casually, she replied, "If the price is fair, I'd be happy to." James closed his eyes, relief washing over him. He didn't have much, but he had enough. All those years of saving, of denying himself small luxuries, of putting money away for emergencies, it had all been for this land. And now, it might save him again. Within weeks, the deal was done. James handed over nearly every cent he had left, signing papers with hands that shook not from fear, but from the weight of what he was about to do. When it was finished, he walked out of that office with something far more powerful than anger. He owned the road. He owned the strip of land with the gate. He owned the only key that mattered. Driving home that night, James felt a sense of strength he hadn't felt in months. The same fence that had trapped him would now trap no one, not without his permission. The HOA had tried to cage him, but in the end, they had made the biggest mistake of all. They had built their prison on land that wasn't theirs. For the first time in a long while, James smiled. The fight was far from over, but now he had the upper hand, and he knew exactly what he was going to do next. The news spread quickly through the neighborhood, though James never announced it himself. He didn't need to. The HOA discovered the truth the moment they tried to hold their usual meeting about security upgrades. When they pulled up the land record, they saw James's name written in bold letters as the new owner of the strip where their precious gate stood. It was almost poetic. The very gate they had used to trap him was no longer theirs. It belonged to the man they had tried to drive out. James didn't rush into confrontation. He waited. He carried on with his work, fixing tractors, tending to his fields, feeding his animals. But now, when he passed the gate, he no longer felt the sting of humiliation. Instead, he felt a quiet strength. That gate, that lock, that key was his. And soon, the HOA would learn what that meant. The chance came during the next HOA meeting. James walked into the community hall, the same place where he had once stood humiliated, pleading for fairness. The room fell silent the moment he entered. Dozens of polished faces turned toward him, their eyes filled with surprise, some with discomfort, and a few with outright anger. At the front of the room sat Richard, the president, his suit crisp and his smile thin. "Well, Mr. Walker," Richard said with forced politeness, "this is a private meeting." James placed a folder of papers on the table in front of him and met Richard's gaze. His voice was calm, steady, carrying none of the desperation it once had. "I think you'll want to see these," he said. Richard frowned, but curiosity got the better of him. He opened the folder, his eyes scanning the documents. Slowly, the confident smirk faded from his face. The deed, the maps, the signatures all clear, all legal. James Walker owned the land beneath their gate. "You built your fence on property that was never yours," James said softly, but his words carried through the room. That gate, that road, it belongs to me now. Which means, from this day forward, if you want to come in and out, you'll need my permission." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Neighbors exchanged nervous glances. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Richard's face turned pale, his jaw tight. For the first time, the power in the room shifted. Richard tried to recover. "You can't be serious. This affects dozens of families. You wouldn't block their access." James looked around the room, his eyes steady, his voice even. "For weeks, you trapped me on my own land. You ignored me when I begged for help. Because of your gate, I lost a horse. I lost peace. I lost time with my family. You didn't care then. Now the decision is mine." The silence that followed was heavy. No one moved. No one dared to speak. James leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but unshakable. "I'm not here for revenge. I don't want to hurt anyone, but I will never be caged again. The fence comes down, and the harassment stops. If not, then every single one of you will have to find another way home, because the only key that works now," he tapped the folder gently, "is mine." The room erupted. Some shouted in anger, others in shock. A few even clapped quietly. Neighbors who had always thought the HOA went too far, but never had the courage to say it. Richard tried to argue, his words sharp and desperate, but it was useless. The truth was in black and white, stamped and signed. James had turned their weapon into his shield. As James walked out of the hall, the evening air felt lighter. For the first time in months, he didn't feel trapped. He felt free. The fight wasn't finished, but the tables had turned, and now the HOA had no choice but to face him on equal ground, or lose everything they thought they controlled. The days after the meeting were filled with tension. The HOA members, who had once spoken with such arrogance, now avoided James's eyes when they passed him. The power they had used to cage him had slipped from their hands, and they knew it. The fence that had once stood as their symbol of control now felt like a wall pressing against them instead. At first, Richard and a few others tried to fight back. They sent letters filled with legal threats, claiming James had no right to restrict access. But each time, James calmly replied with copies of the deed, signed and sealed. The law was on his side, and no amount of bluster could change that. Eventually, the HOA realized they had only two choices: negotiate or suffer. Without James's permission, the gate could remain locked forever. Families would be stranded. Deliveries would stop. Their perfect neighborhood would turn into a cage of its own, making the same trap they had built for James now loomed over them. So they came to his porch one warm afternoon, a group of them led by Richard. For once, Richard's voice carried no arrogance. His words were clipped, tired, edged with defeat. "Mr. Walker," he said, "we'd like to discuss an arrangement." James sat back in his chair, his coffee steaming in his hands. He didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He simply listened, as the men who had once mocked him now pleaded for fairness. They promised to take down the fence, to end the harassment, to put in writing that James would never again be bothered by HOA rules. For a long moment, James was quiet. The wind rustled through the fields. The horses grazed nearby, tails flicking lazily. Finally, he spoke, his voice steady. "I never wanted a fight. All I wanted was peace on my land. If you honor that, then I'll honor your right to pass through. But if you ever try to cage me again, I won't hesitate to lock that gate for good." Richard swallowed hard and nodded. The papers were drawn up within days. The fence around James's ranch came down piece by piece. Where once there had been cold, towering metal, now there was open space again. James stood by the porch as the last section was removed, the sound of drills and hammers echoing like freedom returning to the air. When it was finished, James walked his fields with tears in his eyes. The wide horizon stretched before him again, unbroken. The land felt alive, as if it too had been waiting for this day. He thought of his lost horse, of the long nights spent locked out, of the despair that had nearly crushed him, and then he thought of the strength it had taken to stand, to fight, to win without becoming bitter. Slowly, life returned to normal. Friends began visiting again, their cars rolling easily up the open road. Family came back on weekends, children running free through the grass, with laughter ringing out like music. Delivery trucks once more pulled into his driveway, and the ranch bustled with the life James had always imagined. But there was one thing that remained different. Every morning, when James sipped his coffee on the porch and watched the sunrise, he slipped his hand into his pocket and touched the small piece of metal that never left his side, the key. It was more than just a tool. It was a reminder that no one could cage him again, a reminder that he had stood against injustice and endured, a reminder that his freedom had been bought not only with money, but with pain, patience, and courage. And whenever he looked at that key, James felt a quiet pride. He had not only reclaimed his land, he had reclaimed his dignity. The ranch was his sanctuary once more. The fields stretched wide and open, the sky endless above him. He had fought for his peace, and he had won, and now, at last, he was truly free.